You now get to hear a little bit of, not a little bit of, more thinking for the last day. I think it's a really, really hard job to be speakers on the final day, isn't it? Because you have a lot of things already happening, a lot of questions posted, and you have a lot of discussion already debated, heated, or shared, or enjoyed. So with our almost kind of like the final sessions of Keynote, we have together with us Professor Kenneth Hamilton from the School of Music at Cardiff University. He's a dean, and he's still a very, very much an active artist, and he has a really wonderful best-known book, After the Golden Age. I wonder if the Golden Age ever go away, but let's discuss on that.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not, yeah. And the After the Golden Age, Romantic Pianism and Modern Performance. So this is one of the things that Professor Kenneth, one of the many things that he did. And the session he will be sharing with us today is called Recording the Repertoire in the 21st Century. We heard the music prayer live, but how about the recording industry? Is it ever any place for classical music? So I leave this to Professor Kenneth Hamilton to find a solution for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anutai. Yeah, I haven't attended everything over the last few days, but I've attended quite a few things. And so some of what I'm going to say to you today and some of what I'm going to play to you today is sort of partly reflective of what we've all been talking about for the last 2 or 3 days. I'm basically going to start with the title of this conference is Celebrating the Now, so I'm going to start with what I think of as the current situation, and then some. No, I'm not going to do anything because this is now wrong. Is that better? Yeah, that's too loud. Can we take the volume? Thank you. Okay. That's what you see. I remember somebody. I'm not a child of the information age. I'm a technological dinosaur. That's why I like the piano, because relatively little can go wrong with the piano, whereas lots of things can go wrong with technology. But I'm forced to see it's falling off again now. I'm forced. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This keeps falling down. Okay, no, that's it. I think that's it. I'm forced to engage with technology. Okay, I'm gonna start with a little reflection of where I think we are, how we got to where we are in terms of current day recording practices and performance practices. I'm going to give a little sort of historical timeline. Some of this will be very familiar to some of you, to some of our younger colleagues it might not be. Some of our older colleagues might even remember some of this happening, and it's frightening that I do remember some of this actually happening from experience. And finally, I want to talk about the last section about how I'm trying to make my own recordings, standard repertoire recordings mostly, still relevant to some extent today, still interesting, still to some extent new, because of course the paradox is that we are all in our repertoire playing music that has been played, tens of thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times, and often recorded dozens of times. So why are we doing it? There's a famous expression, the anxiety of influence, that Harold Bloom coined about sort of poetics. What are we supposed to do now? Okay.
Put it on the side of your
microphone,
even you don't mind.
I don't.
Sorry.
Actually, thank you. This could be a comedy film, actually. I'm thinking it's right there. But don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, it's part of the act. We rehearsed this beforehand. This is now falling off again on a time, and this is right. It doesn't really matter. It's Can I ask you something very radical? What would happen if I just talked to these people who are right in front of me? The online audience, okay.
I didn't use the microphone.
All right, could you use the microphone? Yeah, hold on. I can use the microphone. Thank you, Anutai. Thanks. Hey, I feel like Frank Sinatra. This is great. This is much better. Thank you, Anutai. This is actually much better. And unless I drop it, it won't fall off. Okay. So Harold Bloom coined the expression the anxiety of influence basically about poetry. I have, in terms of classical music recording, the anxiety of irrelevance, shall we say? In other words, why are we doing this again? You know, up till relatively recently, there was an easy answer that effectively the repertoire got re-recorded every time a new technology came out. You know. And I'll talk a little bit about the historical timeline of recording. So you could say, okay, I recorded this on 78s, but now long playing records have come in and I will re-record this and it'll be better technology. But now we're in a digital era. Sure, we might get a thing of hologram recording. There'll be a hologram recording and that somebody will be in front of you playing the piano or the violin or whatever. But until that happens, we're stuck with an ever increasing sort of circle of, shall we say, either futility or just repetition. So the question that always comes to my mind is, why am I recording the repertoire at all? You know, what is new about this? And there's no doubt that some of this is vanity. We all as musicians are egoists to some extent, even if we don't admit it, and we are vain and we want to put our interpretation, whatever it is. And if we get to an extreme of this, we get to some piano players, what name, who have recorded, say, the Schumann Piano Concerto 7 or 8 times, you know, claiming that they found something new in it, or so, you know, whatever, which just seems to me to be the ultimate in vanity. But I'm not free of my own little vanity. So sure, one of the reasons I want to record standard repertoire pieces in my repertoire is because, you know, I want my recording of that to be out there. I want to be able to, and we might as well accept that. If I'm very lucky, people will buy the recording or enjoy listening to it. But we are, as musicians, have our own little brand of egotism. I also record contemporary music, some of which hasn't been recorded before, and that is a completely different issue, a completely different feeling, if you like. For a start, I know that this is useful. For anybody that happens to be interested in this sort of music. I know it's useful for the composer. I'm contributing, if you like, to the contemporary narrative of music, even in a little way. And I don't have the same feeling of potential irrelevance, because it's inevitably new, whether you like it or not. So that's why I called this recording the repertoire in the 20th century. In other words, how do we make things at least to some extent new or relevant if it's already music that's been recorded hundreds or even thousands of times? Okay, the other thing is repertoire, and I think this is changing. This came up in a sideline in one of the conversations after one of the lectures about 2 years ago. I use the expression repertoire, meaning the standard repertoire, which would mean sort of, Beethoven, Chopin, Wagner, Liszt, Schumann, Richard Strauss, whatever. But now, from a perspective of from a perspective of 2022, this question, the question of what is the standard repertoire, is becoming a bit more tenuous and interesting. What seems to be happening is that all sorts of hitherto minor composers are being rediscovered, minor historical composers. A colleague of mine in Cardiff has just produced his 3rd volume of complete premier recordings of a Russian late Romantic composer called Barmotin. And I'd never heard of Barmotin, even though I think I know the repertoire pretty well. I'd never heard of Barmotin. So he's produced three volumes of this, as I once joked, all your favorite Barmotin tracks on one CD, sort of thing. So it's completely new, and so there's this rediscovery of it, if you like, sort of sideline figures going on. But apart from that, what seems to be happening is those historical composers who are already well known, Beethoven, Mozart, Vadhana, whatever, are becoming even better known, if you like. If you look at the listening figures on Spotify and YouTube or whatever, and to the extent the repertoire is narrowing on the other side. So we have this issue, and again, the problem of circularization. Do we really need another set of Beethoven's 9 symphonies by another conductor with another modern orchestra? The bottom line is we don't. Maybe this conductor thinks we do, but obviously the listening public doesn't actually need that. So the repertoire itself is narrowing at one side and ironically widening at the other side. Maybe there's only a few thousand people in the world interested in Barmoten today. He's actually an interesting, very pleasant composer. But at least now the internet will allow these people to listen to this recording. So in a way, the world has become the audience, and that can only be a good thing. But on the other side, the marketing forces effectively increases the primacy of already well-known composers. And it's no coincidence, for example, that one of the crossover pieces that was discussed a few days ago was Vivaldi's Four Seasons, because if you're doing a crossover piece, you need brand recognition, and the brand recognition you need to take from a piece that's already well known, or a composer that's already well known, or Mozart in Angkor Wat, the magic flute in Angkor Wat. The name of Mozart is needed. Dittersdorf in Angkor Wat would not sell very many tickets, because you basically don't have even if Dittersdorf, Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf, contemporary of Mozart, even if his music is perfectly pleasant, what we're looking for here is brand recognition. It's a commercial branding exercise. So there's the question of what is the repertoire in this sense, and why are we actually doing it now? We're also then talking about performance practice. Can we renew our attitude to the repertoire by changing our performance practice of it? And this is what a lot of us are obviously, and to some extent what I'm doing. When I was a student, I was a sort of music student in the late 1970s, sort of early 1980s. And looking back now, I think that was probably one of the worst times in the century to be a music student. It was one of the most ossified times. I didn't realize that in terms of performance practice, it was one of the most restricted. There was a level of post-war certainty that what everybody was doing was the only way. To play the only way to play Beethoven, and this is what Mozart would have wanted and stuff. And we now know that it was almost completely wrong. In a historical sense, almost everything we were taught was totally wrong. I now know that, but it was said with such certainty, because your teacher would say, well, my teacher said it, this was how it was supposed to be, and his teacher said that, and her teacher said that, all the way back to Anton Rubinstein. It often got back to Anton Rubinstein in terms of piano, which was quite interesting. Another whole lecture. So there was a certainty there that wasn't actually deserved. This certainty had been arrived at effectively without paying much attention to early recordings. And this is really, really very interesting. This was a certainty arrived at partly by passing knowledge, inaccurate knowledge, often from teacher to pupil and teacher-pupil, apostolic succession, and partly by reading written treatises about music, but very rarely listening to recordings. Robert Phillip, who, as you might know the name, who wrote a sort of groundbreaking book in the late 80s, early 90s, called Early Recordings and Musical Style, told me that what difficulty had getting a doctoral topic involving recordings accepted by Oxford and Cambridge. In the end, he did a dissertation on early recordings and musical style, which became the book eventually in Cambridge. But he went to Oxford and said, I'm interested in studying early recordings, and was told recordings aren't music. Who cares about recordings? They're just ephemeral, peripheral things. The recordings actually you should be analyzing the score. So that wasn't a reasonable topic. So eventually, Cambridge accepted it, and then when the book came out, Robert Phillip pointed out that a lot of what you heard on the very earliest recordings was completely different from what the teachers had been teaching about the teacher of the teacher of the teacher. And that some of these early recordings went much further back in time than just the date of the recording. The very earliest recordings, from effectively from about 1880 or so. But these people who were recording in 1880, 1890, 1900 were all older people, because, you know, if you've got a new technology, you don't get some unknown young artist to try it out. You get really famous people to establish the technology. So some of these people that were recording, era recording, had actually been trained, in some cases had been trained before Beethoven had died, you know. Francois Plante had played with Chopin and Liszt and had recorded. Leczetitsky, who was Paderewski's teacher, you know, he also was born before Beethoven died. So now one of the things we know about old people is that they don't tend to change their style radically. They might get slower and slightly angrier, but they don't suddenly most of them don't transform themselves into different types of artists. So there's a fair chance that what we hear in early recordings isn't just the style of 1900, it's the style of somebody trained in 1840 or even earlier, you know, which should tell us an awful lot. And of course, a lot of people who were working in performance at the last thing they wanted was somebody finding a recording that showed that what they deduced from a treatise was completely wrong. It was the last thing they wanted. So recordings were effectively ignored. And when I was a student, in the 70s and 80s, even if you were interested in the recordings, you couldn't even listen to them. I mean, I knew when I first learned Rachmaninoff's piano concerti, I knew Rachmaninoff had made recordings of these pieces, but I couldn't get hold of them. They weren't available commercially. The only way I could have done it was to go down from Scotland to the British Library Sound Archive in London and find them, and there wasn't enough time to do that, so I just basically learned the score. I later discovered that Rachmaninoff's recordings are actually very different in many respects from our normal way of looking at the score. But I only discovered this about 10 years later or so, when, in the CD era, suddenly some of these old recordings began to be retransferred onto CD. And suddenly we began to be able to listen to these things, and we thought, wow, okay, this, you know, he isn't playing it at the tempo, he's put the metronome mark, and now this is coming, and he doesn't play a crescendo here, he plays a diminuendo and all. And it began to make us realize that the composer's own attitude to these scores was freer than our attitude to the scores, you know. And then there was another thing we had to add, that the recordings didn't show us everything. In fact, there was a whole host of annotated practices, either annotated ways of reading the score. In other words, the way we were reading the score was wrong, or was misguided to some extent, or there was a whole lot of improvisatory practices surrounding the score that had been effectively ignored in the second half of the 20th century. And that's why one of the reasons I say that I thought I was trained at a very unfortunate time. I spent there about 15 years ago, I spent ages, as I thought, rediscovering bits for what I thought was rediscovering about the history of improvised in piano playing, improvised preluding and improvised transition playing, which was extremely common, which a lot of the books at that time said died out in the middle to late 19th century, but it turned out that was wrong by about 100 years. It sort of began to die out really around the time of the Second World War. And I spent ages researching this and listening to early recordings, and there are one or two that still have improvised preludes and transitions in them, but very few. And the reason they're very few is because if you have limited recording time, and most of these early recordings you could only play for 4.5 minutes or so, then you didn't waste your 4.5 minutes by improvising a prelude, whether you maybe even had to cut piece anyway, okay? So I spent a long time and discovered that, as I thought, I was very pleased with that this practice had gone on for 8. In fact, we were the odd ones, that we were the only generation, more or less, that had stopped this, you know? But then it turned out, I sent a copy of the resultant book to my old teacher, Ronald Stevenson, who read it and said, oh yes, he said, that's quite right. I remember when I was a student, Ronald was nearly 80 at the time, so I remember when I was a student in 1946, all the older artists on the stage used to improvise. They would improvise preludes and transitions and stuff. But we as young performers were told not to do it and told it was old-fashioned. You know, so that was the exact transition period, you know, and of course I was then the generation being taught by those people who had been told it was old-fashioned. Now, as I have, Ronald didn't think it was old-fashioned, but now there's a lot of this was still within living memory. It's just that we'd chosen to ignore it. And what a lot of us have been doing for the last sort of 10 or 15 years is rediscovering some of these practices. You know, rediscovering the improvisational elements and using that to free up, to some extent, our approach to the score. But these practices don't just free up our approach to the score, they change the way we listen to the score, which I find particularly interesting. For example, and here's just one sort of little example. If you look at most music analysis, the transition between Beethoven, the first movement of Beethoven's C minor Concerto No. 3, ends in C minor, and then begins very famously with a sort of a chord of E major. Yeah, so quite a dramatic harmonic change for the classical area, C minor, E major. And a lot of the analysts go on about the sort of the groundbreaking genius of this and how the shock to the audience that this must have been. The audience would never have heard this. They would never have heard it because the piano player would have improvised a harmonic transition between the C minor and the E major. Sure, they would have noticed it was an E major if they were musicians, but they wouldn't have actually heard the music in live performance like that. So. It's lovely, but it's not would have been heard. That dislocation would have just been more or less unthinkable in the classical era in live performance. In fact, there were still pianists improvising a transition for this in the 1890s. Vladimir de Passman, we know from a review, improvised a transition for this. There's another exact same harmonic change in another concerto in C minor that you probably know, Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto. But what Rachmaninoff does, and here's the sort of, I won't say joke, the little bit of wit that we have completely ignored because we are unfamiliar with these improvised practices, is that there is a transition in the Rachmaninoff, but it isn't improvised by the piano player, it's played by the orchestra. It modulates at the beginning of the second movement, it modulates very obviously from C minor to E major. In a passage that is never repeated, it's just a modulatory passage. And I remember when I was learning this concerto the first time as a student, I thought, I don't know why is this there, you know? I mean, it seems like a bit of boring bits of chords, you know, it's all right, but and then I suddenly realized much later that it's actually quite humorous, or at least it's a gentle piece of witticism, because it's basically the sort of thing it would probably have been improvised between the first movement of Beethoven 3 and the second movement. So Rachmaninoff 2, you all know, ends. And the tune. So if I'd just done that, I'd get exactly the same harmonic transition as the score of Beethoven. Of course, you don't get that. You get then that little scale up is suddenly reharmonized. In other words, something that I thought was absolutely meaningless, you know, I just thought, what's he doing, you know, isn't meaningless at all, but it suddenly takes on meaning if you know how these things tended to be performed. And of course, Rachmaninoff was a late 19th century piano player, composer. So it's not just, oh, there's this little bit of improvisation. This little bit of improvisation actually affects the way they would have heard the music, and we respond to the music. Now, I'm not going to say now, normally in performance practice terms, I should say, well, if we are playing this music now, we should improvise in between. We can do that, yeah. But what I'm saying is we need to be aware of this, because this is one of the possible meanings of this music that has been lost. One of the things I always say to the students is a bit like, it's a bit like the language of Shakespeare, which is not the modern English, it's not the English language, and a lot of the witticisms, the puns, the jokes in Shakespearean English we don't recognize now. There's a famous couple of lines in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which goes Rome, i.e. Rome, the city of Rome, Rome and room enough when there is within it but only one man. Yeah. Now, Shakespearean scholars tell us in Shakespeare's day, in Shakespeare's accent, Rome and room were both pronounced the same thing. So it's basically a pun. It's a sort of mild joke, you know, room and room enough when one only. But we've completely lost that meaning because we now pronounce these words completely differently or very differently. So the same thing with music. We've effectively lost the meaning of the transition in Rachmaninoff's second concerto because we're not familiar with the improvisational practices that were behind it. Likewise, if we carry on with Beethoven, we've completely lost I think the intended effect of the opening of the fourth piano concerto, which, as you very well know, G major as a normal prelude in G major, which would have been sort of improvised, and then supposedly the joke is that the orchestra comes in the wrong chord with B. But I suspect we've got this the wrong way around because remember that this piano concerto was premiered in a massive concert that went almost completely wrong, where Beethoven was premiering a lot of his pieces and Beethoven was playing himself. Czerny was there, and again there would have been these preludes between pieces, especially ones involving the piano. So this would have been the prelude, okay, and prelude in G, and you preluded either in the key of the piece or on the dominant. Obviously, that was the whole point. And the only person that wouldn't have been playing from the score, obviously, was the piano player in the improvisation sections, obviously. So in fact, the joke isn't that the orchestra has come in the wrong key. The joke is the piano player has fixed the wrong key. In the first place, is played in G. And Czerny, there's another, I think, amusing thing about classical music today about this thing. Czerny, when he wrote his little book on the proper performance of Beethoven, just automatically put an arpeggiated sign in front of that opening chord. There isn't one in the score, but Czerny heard the first performance, and anybody who knows anything about early 19th century, late classical music would know that is an improvisatory style opening, and therefore it's likely that these big chords are arpeggiated chords. So what Czerny writes effectively reinforces the idea of it being, if you like, a written out improvisator, written out prelude. Of course, what happens nowadays is that hardly anybody plays it arpeggiated, and it's supposed to be this really profound thing where you go. And usually you're looking up in the air. It's exactly the same as it's the same as the Beethoven the third piano concerto. That chord, that E major chord, what you're actually supposed to be doing is frowning, looking extremely serious, and looking as if you're about to be tortured, and then go like this and look up into the air. But see, there's this ridiculous sense of false profundity. Most people don't arpeggiate this chord, I'm pretty sure now, because you can't get the frowning sort of Beethoven, like we think of Beethoven as frowning, like this sort of thing. Somebody once described that chord as one of the most profound chords in classical music. It's total bullshit. I mean, it's a G major chord, for goodness sake, with a B on top, designed to basically set the key. Sure, it's a lovely passage, but we have turned it into this sort of myth of of Beethoven. You know, this is our mythical, iconographic Beethoven. It's not the Beethoven Czerny heard, because he obviously heard that arpeggiated and as a prelude. And so the joke is that or the witticism, I prefer to say, that the pianist has improvised in the wrong, is improvised in the wrong key. The orchestra is going, no, it should be B or E. And then, but we'll get back to the right key, to the Piri. And we're nearly there. Now we're back to, now we can actually start together again. And then, of course, the fifth piano concerto sort of carries on the witticism, because both the piano and the orchestra participate in the improvised prelude, basically. And the improvised prelude is this. So all of this is sort of little playing against the improvisation expectations. Now, we don't have to know how to improvise now. We don't even have to do this, but we are losing a bit of the musical meaning of this music if we don't understand the performance background, and we understand where it's coming from. And it's coming from a much freer concert environment, a much looser a concert environment where the soloist actually has got more to contribute, including genuinely creative things. And so we're missing, just like we're missing Shakespeare's Roman room enough when there is within it only one man. You know, we're missing that. It still makes sense, and it's still beautiful, but it makes a different sort of sense, because it would be very difficult to call Lovely as It Is one of the most profound things in all classical music, you know. But then if you frown, and I think, you know, there's a face mask of Beethoven that had a lot to do with this, plaster of Paris, very famous image of looking like this. And as some scholar pointed out, you know, if I went and covered your face with wet plaster of Paris, just like that, you'd go like that. You know, and this doesn't mean that this face mask doesn't mean that Beethoven was an angry, annoyed person. It just means that he didn't like somebody shoving a lot of basically cement onto his face. It was rather unpleasant, you know. So we have this image of the angry, furious, frowning Beethoven, and this is in a way the musical iconography of this image of Beethoven. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It just means that the meaning, to some extent, has changed a little bit, you know. But there's tons of examples of this, all sorts of examples. So my point to the younger musicians here is that these things are not just performance practices; they're also means of musical understanding. They're means of creating a musical world. And so when we have, if you like, rediscovered improvisational practices laboriously over the last 10 or 20 years, and I just saw a Kars here giving a sort of, you know, the end of an interesting presentation on exactly that. What it is a rediscovery. We are going back to the past and finding out more about it. It's like these T.S. Eliot lines, and the end of all our exploring shall be to arrive at where we began, and understand the place for the very first time. In other words, we have lots. So what I want to say is that in fact, the teachers were to some extent wrong. My teachers in the 70s, 80s, not all of them, but a lot of them were, in that we haven't preserved musical knowledge, you know, by passing it on. We've actually lost a lot of it. Some of this has become a foreign language that we have to rediscover, or if we're wanting to make it new. And this sort of rediscovery is the sort of thing I think offers us one possible solution to re-recording the standard repertoire. And I don't mean recording the Schumann Piano Concerto in almost exactly the same way 7 or 8 times. I mean, if we have got something that we think, even in a minor way, is genuinely new, then that, at least for me, or it's a rediscovery of the old, that to me gives me some sort of justification. Now, we can go through here, and I want to just show you that, as for the younger people, I'll skip some of this here, how this sort of, you know, chronology actually worked. These, you know, the very earliest recordings are from about the 1880s. And one of the really interesting, very primitive recording, we could give another talk on the history of sound recording. It's actually really interesting because you can't really understand recordings until you know the technology they were made with. A lot of people are trying to reverse engineer early recordings now and discover that some of the things that we thought were artifacts of musical style is really all what happens when you put two people in a really hot recording studio that can't see each other, you know, and can't hear each other properly, and then can't hear what you've played, and you end up with less good coordination. You might otherwise have had these sort of rather similar. So that's the sort of early Edison sort of similar cylinder phonograph. But if I can get this to play, I'd just like to. I guess I find this wonderful. Edison's engineer. One of his engineers went around Europe and interviewed really famous people in the late 1880s and showed them this new recording device about how it would reproduce sounds of music, and it was a miracle. It was science fiction, this sort of thing. And one of the people that he interviewed was Sir Arthur Sullivan, the British composer of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas. And Sullivan, and he interviewed him after a dinner party in the house of the English poet Sir Robert Browning. So they were all very drunk, is the point, which is something that you can hear it in Sir Arthur Sullivan's slurred voice. But this is great because we're basically hearing, you know, almost 140 years ago, if I can get this to play. But Sullivan's reaction to the new recording thing was amazement, but also slight horror and worry, and I think this is actually it tells us a lot if I can actually get this to work.
Little Menlo, October 5th, 1888, from Keynote to Edison. Continuation of introduction of train. Now listen to the voice of Sir Arthur Sullivan.
Dear Mr. Edison.
If my friend Edmund Yates has been a little incoherent, it is in consequence of the excellent dinner and good wine that he has drunk.
In other words, they're all very drunk.
Therefore, I beg you will excuse him. He has his lucid intervals. For myself, I can only say that I am astonished and somewhat terrified as the result of this evening's experiment. Astonished at the wonderful power you have developed, and terrified at the thought that so much hideous dance music may be put on record forever. But all the same, I think it is the most wonderful thing that I have ever experienced, and I congratulate you with all my heart on this wonderful discovery. Arthur Sullivan.
So, in other words, Sullivan didn't, shall we say, wholeheartedly welcome the existence of recording technology. I think this is actually wonderful. I'm basically saying all this terrible bad music is going to be immortalized forever. Why on earth do you want to record this stuff? You know, it's what he's saying. And the interesting thing is, if we give you this sort of little thing. This is really a little timeline of recording, effectively. But the really interesting thing is that it's really only until about the Second World War that our music era begins to exist, which is that recordings are more important than live music. If you think about it, we're all musicians here, right? But even we probably hear and perform far more live music than the vast majority of people. But nevertheless, I would guess that the vast majority of music that we all hear is recorded music in some sort of way or other. And that's an issue also, I think, for our conservatory and university courses as well, because I don't know what it's like here, but certainly in a lot of Britain and other places I know, it's still very much a live music based performance courses, which is great in many ways. I love it, but in fact a lot of our careers will be made in recording or other sorts of broadcast music. So in a way we're still in some respects in Arthur Sullivan's era in terms of some aspects of our conservatory curriculums, but it's really only in this sort of second stage if I can sort of, go over here, it's really only with the spread of editing technology, and especially, and then the long playing record, just after the Second World War, that you're able to do two things, that you're able to record pieces of music longer than about 4.5 minutes, but without doing it on separate discs, yeah? And finally, you're actually able to edit. And the only previous technology you could edit if you were a piano player was piano rolls, which was, and people loved doing piano rolls because if you played a wrong note, you could edit it out. There was a famous story of the name of the piano player has never been mentioned. That some well-known piano player in the 1920s recorded the Chopin double third study, but just played single notes and told the piano roll editor to add the thirds. For complete accuracy, And then editing technology comes along, and suddenly you can record full-length pieces. To some, you still have to put a Wagner opera on various sides. And you can edit. It's a bit laborious at first. Now we have digital editing technology, of course, which is an awful lot easier. None of you will be surprised to know that there are probably some artists today whose careers could not exist without digital recording technology. We all know who they are, but we won't say anything because this is a family show, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, so they couldn't possibly exist. But at that point, this is the point really where the musical world begins to move to the recordings being the prime medium, and a lot of the spontaneity of earlier approaches to live music begins to go, and we begin to start trying to imitate recording music in our live performance. We get much more worried about wrong notes. We get much more worried about capricious interpretation. But in other words, our interpretation begins to move towards a mean, and I do it too. I'm caught in the same mad trap as well. That I listen to a take of an edit, of something I'm recording. I go, yeah, okay, I like it, but it's a bit extreme, I mean, what's it going to sound like if you listen to it 5 times? And this was something that would never have occurred to anybody who was trained before the recording era, because each performance was remade anew, in the interpretation as well as any improvisatory element. So there's a tendency to get more and more boring, or a bit more and more middle of the road. Because you edit yourself, if you like. It's not that anybody's telling you this, but because you immediately think, well, hold on, am I sounding eccentric? So we're in this sort of vicious circle that inevitably, unless you fight, even if you fight against it, means that we tend to lose a certain amount of spontaneity. I mean, the most I can think of, we try to be aware of it, and to some extent fight against it. But look, I still say to myself someday, okay, I like that take best, but I messed up bar 42, so I'm going to have to do it again, And I'd love to feel the freedom and self-confidence, say, okay, sure, I messed up bar 42, but hey, who cares, that sort of thing. But then I just know I'm going to open Gramophone magazine and somebody's going to say, and he can't even play bar 42 properly. No, that sort of thing. I mean, the most famous example of this is Vladimir Horowitz's return concert to the Carnegie Hall in 1966. Which was published as was issued as a live recording, was in fact edited, surreptitiously edited, because Horowitz had played certain really prominent rock. He was hugely nervous. He hadn't played in Polyphony for 12 years. He was a bundle of nerves. And even the first bar had a wrong note in it. And the second movement, the Schumann Fantasy, was total mess at the end. And it was issued as the historic performance, but was silently edited. I mean, in fact, so many of the reviewers had been at the concert that some of them started complaining that this was actually, morally incorrect, And Horowitz initially denied it and said, well, he said that the record company tell me that's how it was, So he was sort of in denial himself. So again, we could talk about the morality of issuing edited recording as live recording, which happens a lot, but a lot of the recordings that you will hear as students, for example, as live recording, yeah, sure they're live, but they're an edited version of 3 or 4 live performances all spliced together. So what I think is unfair, and I get a bit annoyed about it, and I've said it, I always say on the BBC, stuff like that, it gives music students an unfair impression of just how accurate musicians are in real life. condition, you know, so you hear these live things, you go, this is amazing, this guy's played for 45 minutes, there's nothing wrong at all, you know, even the slightest slip. Well, sure, because it's all been edited together. I mean, there are some of these live recordings that very famously one, it was a product of 45 live performances all edited together. So there's lots of issues with the music industry in this sort of way, but they only begin in that sort of way in terms of even basic honesty and the change of the worldview around the end of around the end of Second World War. There's a very funny comment, amusing comment in the 1920s by Fred Geisberg, who was the chief recording engineer of HMV in London at the time, and when he was asked why there were relatively few recordings of Brahms' piano music available on his catalogue, he said, well, to be honest, I'm not really sure, but what I think is it's probably the case that the pieces take too long to practice to make it worthwhile for a pianist to learn them just for recordings. You think of the inversion there, you know, the recording is the sort of secondary medium, and, you know, nobody's going to want to practice the Paganini studies just for a recording. You know, you need to make sure you had lots of performances lined up. So that's the point that we suddenly change. And at each of these changes of technology, more of the repertoire gets recorded and re-recorded. Sort of back to the beginning, until we get to the stage today, where the most famous pieces have been literally recorded thousands of times, with everybody claiming that their recording is either the perfect one or the best one or something new, or, you know, and of course it can't be, and it can't be for mine as well. So I'm going to finish up. So and this is just a personal thing, and I'm going to stop, and I know we started a bit late, but I don't want to go along and make everything else even later. There can only be personal answers to this. I say one easy personal answer is just record new music, which is the most straightforward. But supposing you love certain pieces of the repertoire, and this is an emotional thing for all of us. Almost virtually everybody here, maybe everybody here, has spent masses of their childhood perfecting a sort of art and talent and craft, and has invested a huge amount of emotion. Some of our most vivid formative years are connected with this music, which we love. And of course, it's become internalized as part of us, if you like. And therefore, of course, we want to, if we have the opportunity, we want to be able to record it, we want to put whatever small our own stamp on it. So you know, that's understandable. What isn't understandable is selling this as some sort of revelation from God or whatever, that, you know, when it obviously isn't. So my little bit of revelation is what I actually try to do. Is sort of to, it's a bit like what I was actually talking about at the beginning, and I'm going to skip a lot here. I'm going back to this. My last release was the first volume of Liszt series, double CD. It contains some relatively little known pieces, like a little piece called In the Festival of the Transfiguration of Our Lord Jesus Christ, which very few people have recorded. And also things that have been recorded for hundreds of thousands, like the sonata or whatever. And basically what I tried to do, now this is a colorized picture of Liszt with some of his students in Weimar in 1884. And this guy here, Arthur Friedheim, was the only student of Liszt that we know to have studied the piano sonata personally with Liszt. And he made a piano roll recording which had been thought to be lost. And in fact, when I wrote on this, you know, in the mid-1990s, I wrote, you know, I wish somebody could find this recording. It turned out that this recording actually did exist in collections by piano roll enthusiasts, but the piano roll enthusiasts weren't the same people as the performers or the musicologists. They were their own little world. And then eventually this became discovered. It was also discovered that Friedheim had intended to make an edition of the Liszt Sonata, which still exists in the Peabody Institute. It was unpublished before his death, and we also had this guy also edited the piece. There are also other famous piano players here. Moritz Rosenthal, very very famous. Alexander Charlotte, Rachmaninoff's cousin, who sort of also made editions of Liszt and various things like this. Alfred Reisenar. So we have a whole series of the next generation of famous piano players and editors. And to summarize here, what I discovered was that basically what Liszt taught these people in terms of the sonata and many other pieces was very much at variance with what was in the score. Sometimes Liszt had changed his mind. Sometimes, obviously, Liszt, was fine with all sorts of freedoms that we don't have now. Sometimes he would even collaborate with the student. If students had come up with some idea, and he'd go, "Yeah, that's the second version of the Liszt Schubert Soirée de Vienne has got a chord in it by Hans von Bülow," and you can see in the manuscript. This really is quite fun chord. Here's the original verse. Second version. And that's the weird chord, which was actually by Hans von Bülow. And now we're back into the original. That's all right. It's okay. It's part of the act. But thank you. So these were some aspects of these things. Thank you. Were sort of collaborative things. Anyway, once you connect all this together, you actually do end up with versions of some of these well-known pieces that are a bit different. And I thought, okay, am I just imagining this? Because I'm so het up with this little world that I think, the change of an accidental in bar 268 I regard as a major achievement, sort of thing. But in fact, sometimes it does actually make a genuine difference to the musical affect of certain passages, and I was very glad to see that that's what the reviewers thought too. I know we all say we don't read our reviews, of course we never read our reviewers, so this sort of thing, we don't care what reviewers think. But the best advice I think to young musicians is when reviewers like what you're doing, talk a lot about it, and when they don't, just ignore them, okay? So reviewers did receive this as something different and new, which I was very glad about. But I'm not saying this is possible, although this is only possible because of the reasons that I taught at the beginning, that for the last few decades there's been a willful ignoring of all sorts of material that's to do with practical performance, a willful ignoring in this case of what he taught in master classes, of the way his pupils played from, which is often described as a corrupt tradition. But corrupt tradition just means something you don't like. If the evidence leads you to a direction you don't like, you say, "Oh, this can't be right, so it must be a corrupt." It's just like there was a whole scene in Shakespeare's Macbeth that didn't fit with romantic ideas of how Macbeth ought to go because it was too jokey. It was full of rude jokes. Porter's scene. So for about 150 years, scholars said this is a corrupt interpolation. It must have been written by somebody else. Of course it wasn't, So basically, the musical world recreates these things in its own image, and it's our business, or it can be in our business, to go back to our beginning, shall we say, and suddenly understand the place for the first time, and that in itself is new. But then, to your next generation, if we succeed in this will be our little bit of novelty. If we succeed in this, then we will make ourselves obsolete. We will be the old hat. Our destiny is always, success means that it's been done, and then something else new will have to be found. And maybe that will be going back to the old, or maybe that will be something completely different. We've already been discussing this. In other words, we redefine our now, And in redefining it, if we're successful, we create the seeds of our own obsolescence, and that's what is caused, passing down generations. Passing down generations is not, I think, shouldn't be people copying each other. It should be people's own self-realization that if this music is to survive, every generation will find something new that means something different to them. To record in it, and that is actually the best form of survival. It's a continuous process of change and self-obsolescence. And on that happy note, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
That is absolutely amazing. Thank you very, very much. Let me get my note. Thank you for being being loosely spontaneous about the microphone as well. So thank you so much. And then I have some questions, but first I have to maybe kind of share with you. I really like following the discussion we had already from the improvisation. First, we were trying to get the improvisation into the schools, but I'm really glad to see that maybe in the near future we will see improvisation having its way into a recording. So this would be a really wonderful thing to see. And I wouldn't mind having a hologram of you improvising a G major chord in SVH Hall in the future. So I'd love to see that very, very much. And of course you mentioned about like maybe I know exactly what to get you for a Christmas present is the Beethoven's phone standing. Yes, or something like that. So that we can have maybe the ideas of like just one thing, freeze in time, never grows is really, we will not survive these centuries anymore. I think I remembered like when we're studying, we are also prohibited to improvise on anything. And remember, there was once that we have a student audition into our schools, and he's coming with a little bit of a background of traditional music. So the first thing he did when he arrived in our schools, before playing anything, he was improvising on the first chord. And my first reaction was like, oh, is it wrong? But actually, that's the way to do. And the student that hasn't got any connotation whether how the music should be performed. So maybe there's a hope also for and you remember that student, right, Top? I think he was kind of like just in front of the piano in his recital and was just kind of improvising on the first chord. So congratulate to him that he will have a real good career in this century. So my first questions, if you don't mind me, I really liked your presentation. I'm just wondering that now you can see that there are a lot of musicians starting to put their own recording on Spotify or Apple Music or this kind of thing. I mean, in the last century, you need a sort of permission from the recording company and all this kind of thing, right? And do you think that will change a lot of the landscape, that we do not have someone standing at the gate saying that you are, as Mr. Sullivan said, that not making any hideous music?
Yeah, I think all these things just widen the amount of music available. It's a bit like the news thing. There's useful news, there's fake news, a thing like that. The advantage is that more things are available, and there is no gateway for promulgation. And it means that certain talented artists or people with something different who would probably have been previously ignored will have the possibility, but it also means that there is no editing process. There is no gateway in the other sense. So there's an awful lot of rubbish out there as well. I mean, and things that are really a travesty of the score. And I don't mean travesty of the score in the sense of deliberately altering the score, but there's a lot of sort of incompetence. So you get both things. And what I wonder is how much, whether it increases the value of our musical education like you get here in other places, or whether it devalues it. I suspect both in certain sense. I can't help feeling though that overall it must be a good thing, because again, I'm going back to the beginning. If you can find the 2,000 people in the world who are interested in some obscure thing, then you're bringing that together. So that in itself is an advantage. The other good thing about it is, I think apart from technological reasons, one of the reasons the improvisatory practices that were quite common until about 1945 or so weren't on record, apart from the length, is that they were exactly that. They were live music improvisatory practices. When Paderewski made a studio recording of the Moonlight Sonata, he started with the first notes of the piece. When you hear him do a radio broadcast in the late 1930s, he starts with a little improvised prelude, because that's, the radio broadcast is the live sort of experience. So in a way, some of the stuff now we're getting recorded on YouTube is more like the live experience, and that must be a good thing, because music depends on context, and that I think we've got more contextual awareness now.
Anyone would like to share some ideas or questions? Yeah. Yeah, please.
First of all, thanks for a lovely talk. And I wish that in many conservatories we had more of these discussions and just simply, you know, talk about these things and realize how things work historically. And thank you also for sort of demystifying the G major chord. I think it's bread and butter. We do all our cooking with it, you know, and nothing special, but great ingredients. and wonderful. I had personally never realized that actually that beginning of the Beethoven concerto is already kind of referencing to a prelude, and that you could indeed be preluding there before going on into the material. Yeah, very interesting. And I just had a thought because I also used to have, I was a piano student in the 80s, and I did have a teacher whose name I won't mention, who actually also called herself straight into the, I don't know, 4th or 5th generation of Chopin students, you know, so, and it was kind of to legitimize herself and to authorize herself, you know, that everything she said must be true. I realized also through what you were saying, like you have this game, you know, that you whisper a word and you whisper to the next person and the next person, next person, and then see what comes out, even after 5 or 6 takes. And I think this is very, very much true about music teaching, because each teacher takes sort of the authorization of their fantastic master, and then comes a huge amount of ego and a huge amount of distortion, and then comes the passing on to the next one. So yeah, I hardly agree with you that that's an important thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, there's another. I didn't go about there. In fact, the opening of that concerto, the 4th concerto, is very similar to a Clementi prelude in C minor. The Beethoven would have known because it was part of the preludes that he recommended to his nephew Carl. Yeah.
And then you'll have to credit Wagner for actually doing something much better with it. But
oh, come on. That's Lorelei is beautiful, but yeah, Wagner, yeah, Wagner's. Look, I'll tell you, I'm not going to quite allow you that, Karis. It's you're right, the Wagner, okay, Tristan and Lorelei is different scale, but ich weiß nicht, was soll's bedeuten. Now, if that's a diminished 7th chord thing. I think it's, and then that beautiful tune. But yeah, look, I'm a huge Wagner fan, so I'm with you. I'm with you with the second part.
Thank you very much. A really, really inspiring talk, and got me to think a lot. And I was reflecting very much on what I just recently read. We read from Mozart and from Beethoven that they complain quite a lot about musicians not adjusting the tempo of the piece quite correctly to the musical phrase, but play everything in the same tempo through. We've, I think, in recording industry, spoiled a lot of us because it put the musician, the performing musician, very much under pressure to perfection. So we were not allowed to take those risks anymore because a recording session, especially for a huge orchestra, is expensive. But we have those recordings like Richard Strauss conducting Mozart, where he changes the tempo for every phrase, and sometimes for hours, like quite shockingly fast. But so we can look back there, but I think there's also one aspect, and that will be always interesting to hear also recorded music from now, because I do feel that recording also reflects what would have made impact on people at that time. So what would create that emotional impact? So we have the recordings of, especially if you stay with Beethoven, Mozart, shortly after the war, or the Carl Böhm recordings, which are from nowadays perspective quite boring, right? For many, and we have this extremely live and almost aggressive kind of recordings that existed, are coming now into musician. So we see also a reflective of time stamp on I think recording is also made for an audience, so we can hear what audience would have thought. So I think in that sense, recordings, again, these kind of pieces is actually quite interesting. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think each area has its own validity, and it must be... where I differ from the normal performance practice thing, I think, is to say, okay, Bach seemed to have done it this way, and this was the interest, so this is how we should do it. I think we ought to know how this may have been done, because it affects the musical rhetoric and it affects the musical understanding. But then, if you do want to do it like Otto Klemperer or Karl Böhm, then that is a conscious artistic decision. So you need that. But what's important to me is that it's a conscious artistic decision, not just some ignorant thing because you don't know any better, because somebody's told you that this is how it ought to be or whatever. Especially in the German-speaking lands, for this sort of museum idea for things like that. But it does. But each generation has its own validity, if you like. I mean, look, I play Chopin Opus 10 No. 3 far more slowly than it ought to go because I sort of like it, and you know, but it's totally wrong. I should be playing it about 60%, well, 50% faster. But anytime I have tried to play or have played 50% faster, people have come up to me and said, "Why are you playing this so quickly?" So
There's also the famous thing is like Mozart or Haydn write quite clearly whether they want in a menuetto the menuet repeated or not, or when you don't want it to repeat it in the da capo. And there's the famous story that's mostly disappeared because without the repeat it fits on one side of a shellac.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, if
we are used to it now that we don't do it.
Yeah, it's just become I mean, some of the younger students here. If you wonder why pop songs tend to be about 3.5, 4 minutes long, it's that same reason. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. The single on that side, yeah. Whereas some of the slightly older people here will remember that, But that's what, and of course we think it's given some gift and time. A really funny thing. The New York Times interviewed me a few months ago, maybe about a year ago, about some. Like I never even heard about some new piano, the latest new piano prodigy who just recorded a set of Chopin nocturnes. I'd never heard of this person, so I just I was claiming that he was recording a CD of Chopin nocturnes because it was the tradition to record Chopin nocturnes as a set, and obviously, I mean, this guy was about 18 or 19 or 20, so he'd obviously been told this, but. How these invented, I mean, these are record company traditions. They're nothing to do with Chopin. Chopin would never have imagined somebody playing his nocturnes, as I said, or whatever. So you get these weird sort of things growing up, and I think and of course I didn't want to slag this guy off because he was a victim, I think, of his management in this sort of sense. So and I just didn't say, but I thought to myself, what is going on here? There's so much misinformation, just stupid. And the final thing is, I was once asked to review a book manuscript, but it was called something like, Russian teachers on Russian piano playing or something like that. And this was full of, it was accounts of master classes in St. Petersburg, Moscow, from old elder Russian teachers, full of misinformation, just rubbish about Liszt would have done it this way and Beethoven would have wanted it. And I just said, look, you can't publish this book because it's actively misleading. It's a lot of people thinking who have no historical knowledge whatsoever, just claiming that this, because they feel that this is how, this must be how Beethoven won. And eventually it was published by a different publisher with sort of, with lower editorial standard, shall we say. But there's so much stuff, it's really arrogant stuff, and we all know the sort of elderly type of teacher that just says, no, it's an A flat there. This is, and this is what Schumann wanted. It's very weird.
I totally agree. That somehow, like when you pass on generations, like the music get diluted, while the ego got more kind of arrogant and condensed in some way. So this is something to be aware of. Yeah. And so I think we sort of like have to put a pause here. But hopefully we can continue this discussion, I think, also for the next session, which we're talking about music anew as well. So, but before heading there, I think maybe, you leave a lot of wonderful rooms to discuss, like, for example, the involvement on sound engineer in order to kind of like revisit all this music so that they no longer be acting as a plumber to fixing all these wrong notes by artists, but maybe involve also in in understanding this, and also like I've heard from some of my students like 5 years ago that they felt that all these YouTube recording things that they've seen actually make them feel much more comfortable in making mistakes, because they felt that if this can be allowed, then we are happy to make more music, because there's a chance that we can learn also from mistakes and then go on forward into something else. So thank you so much, Professor Kenneth Hamilton, for, again, a very passionate and really fun talk. And thank you for revealing a lot of things we should not trust in any of the recordings from now on. So